Miami Department of Archaeology series. We've begun here in February because I was hoping that months ago when we first started planning this that we would be able to do it in person, but obviously that has not changed. So here we are, months later, still meeting virtually. So uh, we'll go through this. As I said, we got about half an hour, and then I'll stop at 1 o'clock. And those of you who want to stay longer, we can stay and do more Q&A or continue on if you'd like. I'm going to assume that I finish this on time. So this is an introduction to biblical archaeology. Now, we started this about last year and then got discontinued, of course, by the pandemic and all. And so I'm starting again the new series, and we're going to go once a month for the next 11 months. But I wanted to put together another introduction just since it's been a while and since we have people who weren't here the first time, so you can get sort of a good grounding, pun intended, that is for archaeology in the Bible, and to know how we know things and how we come to knowledge about biblical things through analyzing the material culture. So today will be a little bit different than all the rest of the presentations that we'll have, in that I'm not really presenting data so much as sort of methods and practices and techniques and all of the things we do to do archaeology. So without further ado, you're looking at a little like an Old Testament sort of village with houses and a little fence around it, but just as a title slide. And I want to go back real quickly, if you'll indulge me here. This is our first Miami tent church, which was founded in 1896. It's the first church in Miami, as many of you may know. And it was begun with this church in a tent along the river on the north side near present-day Miami Avenue. And then a couple of years later, they built our first church, which was built, of course, on land and with materials lent by Henry Flagler himself. And then this church was used until the end of World War II or thereabouts, 1946, and they wanted to get a bigger building. So they built our new building. And here's our first pastor. His name was Reverend Henry Keegwin. And so Pastor Bennick, if he's out there, this is your first, your prototype. So anyway, as we move on, we also had a very famous church member back during the 1920s. And if any of you could identify him, I wish I could have all of you here in person so I could ask your questions and interact more. But this is William Jennings Bryan. And he was a three-time unsuccessful presidential candidate. And he was a member of our church, and it's been said that he had as many as 10,000 for a Sunday school, which he used to have at times out on Bayfront Park, right across the street from my condo today on Biscayne Boulevard. So this is a picture looking towards Biscayne Boulevard, and you can see in the background where that road ran. And then he had large crowds out here outdoors for his Sunday school. So we're not quite to 10,000. I think we're about 9,980 short, but maybe by the time we finish, we can up that number. So that's William Jennings Bryan. Now, I realize, of course, it's Valentine's Day, so I want to wish everybody a happy Valentine's Day. I have a particularly special Valentine today that I would like to recognize and dedicate this talk to, and that is my dear mother. Here's a beautiful picture of her. And I want to say happy Valentine's Day, Mother, my original and highest Valentine of all time. She suffered a stroke on Christmas Day. Fortunately, and thank God we were with her at the time. And she's doing marvelously well and recovering back to her normal self. So thank you and God bless you, Mom. Okay, so here's a little bit of a look ahead. Today we have Introduction to Biblical Archaeology on February the 14th. Then we're going to go chronologically through the Old and New Testaments, more or less. We're going to start with the origins of biblical Israel next month in March. And then you can see the first several talks. And I organized them more thematically and chronologically this time, instead of just doing lists of the best of or the top 10 of the Old Testament and etc. So this will be more thematically arranged, and hopefully it'll give you a better understanding of how it relates to biblical events and people and the various books that we go through historically. Okay, so here's a list of the first 8, and then the last 4, actually the last 3, will be New Testament related, and that's almost in exact ratio to what the number of pages in our Bibles are for the Old and New Testaments. So I hope you don't feel I'm shortchanging our New Testament, but there's so much more in the Old Testament to talk about and to analyze and to show. Okay, so I always like to start with, why do we do archaeology? I mean, as a Christian, of course, archaeologists do archaeology for their own reasons. They just love history. They love to elucidate the past and understand the past better, so they can understand who we are and where we've come from. But as Christians, we have a special mission, and I believe it's important to start with Scripture here in what is really my life verse, 1 Peter 3:15, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. So that's a call to all Christians to be ready to not apologize, but make an apologetic argument, that is, making a reasoned defense for your faith in whatever which way you choose to make that. Jude 3 says, "Beloved, while I was making every effort to write you about our common salvation, I felt the necessity to write to you, appealing that you contend earnestly for the faith, which was once for all handed down to the saints." And finally, the first, well, when the disciples asked Jesus, "What is the greatest commandment?" He said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And the mind part of it is something that we as Christians often don't engage as zealously as I think we should, to engage our intellects and such, to make a better witness of our faith to an unbelieving world. So we're in a very unbelieving world today, maybe more than ever, and they want to see proof. Of course, they want to see scientific proof, whatever that may be. But we have plenty of proof here in archaeology to arm ourselves, and I'll start to unpack that as we go along. Now, it's important also, I like to emphasize that Jesus thought that history was important. This is a list of different references by Jesus to events in the Old Testament, which he considered very important to believe as historically true, not as just as metaphorical or as some legendary account, but as things that actually happened, that he was referencing as, at the time, was their only Bible, our Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. Now, we look at, what is archaeology? Well, archaeology comes from the Greek, and so it comes from archaeos and ologies, which is the study of the ancient world, or ancient, or history, or ancient civilizations. So that in terms of archaeology, just in general, it's the study of antiquity, ancient civilizations, as opposed to anthropology, which studies ancient human ancestry, as it were. But this is the study of civilizations, when we can start to really name people and start to write history based on ancient evidence of inscriptions and history that we know that's been passed down. And this is an analysis of these things through the material culture that we excavate. So what is biblical archaeology? What's the study of antiquity or ancient civilizations as it relates to the Bible, both Old and New Testaments? Where is biblical archaeology? So what is the geographical range of what we're looking at? Is it just Israel? Is it Palestine? Is it Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Levant, or the Eastern Mediterranean, that is? Is it Greece, Italy, Turkey? Well, it's actually all of those things. Everything that ties into the Bible, and all these areas do at various times and points, they are all part of biblical archaeology. So the time period we're looking at, when is biblical archaeology? There are many periods we have divided archaeologically speaking: Chalcolithic, which is the Copper Age; Neolithic, Stone Age; Bronze Age, Iron Age; Persian period; Greco-Roman period. Well, generally speaking, we don't really look at periodization and the Bible until we get to the Middle Bronze to the Late Bronze Age. So here's a quick map. I'll come back to that chronology in just a second. So this is a general map of the whole Eastern Mediterranean, which is really the playing field, if you will, of the Old and New Testaments. Of course, we can go all the way over to Italy as well for part of the New Testament, but this is mainly where it's happening here. And then more specifically in Genesis, God, of course, promised the Israelites on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. And when he said, "To your descendants, I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, Euphrates. And this map in the red lines show roughly that expanse of territory, which it's questionable as whether Israel actually ever controlled this large area, especially up to the north. But it's possible that they could have without actually having a border or a boundary and total political control as we would have in terms of a nation state today. But anyway, that was the land that was promised, the so-called promised land. Some more maps we get into, specifically on the left side, what is today Israel, but you can see also the West Bank cutting a big swath right through the central hill country in the middle of the country. You have the Gaza Strip down here in the lower left, and you have the Golan Heights, all disputed territories, all parts of the biblical playing field. And then in general, we call this area Palestine, but that has a whole history of its own and is also politically fraught. Now, chronologically, we're talking about all the way back to the intermediate bronze to the middle bronze age. We're talking about roughly 2000 BC all the way through in the Old Testament, the Persian period, right down to the time of Alexander in the 4th century. And then we jump basically the Hellenistic period, which we call the intertestamental period. And then we have the New Testament during the Roman, the Herodian period, as it's called here, through the early Roman period in the first, or roughly the end of the 1st century AD. Now, this is another way of looking at a biblical timeline. I couldn't find a better one, unfortunately, but here roughly you're looking at the Old Testament beginning around 2000 BC. These are rough numbers. You have Moses and the Israelites coming in around 1500, King David and Solomon around 1000. And then from 1000 to 500 or so, we have really a high density of biblical history, names, places, events that we can really start to tie in to archaeological and material remains. And then, of course, the New Testament beginning over here on the right. Now, a quick review of the history of this field. I'll just do this you could do several hours on this, but I'll just do about 5 minutes at best. Biblical archaeology began pretty much in the 1800s, the early 1800s. In Europe, we had this whole so-called Enlightenment period where people were looking things more critically, harkening back to the Greeks and the Romans for their learning and using the languages and such and studying history. And then they started looking at the Bible more critically as well and investigating the languages, the ancient manuscripts to see how well they could line up to the Bible that we had been given over the centuries. At that point, the King James version was the predominant one in the English language. So we get to Edward Robinson in the early 1800s, 1838. He made a trip. He was a theologian and a pastor, and he made a trip to the Holy Land to try to locate all of these places in the Bible. And he was the first, really what we would say, the biblical geographer. So he's the father of biblical geography. And he published a 3-volume Biblical Researches in Palestine in 1841. And he identified many, many sites which were accurately identified to this day. So he did an amazing job of starting to locate, as it were, the playing field of the Bible. Then we had an individual named Julius Wellhausen, who was a German, and he came along and started to look at the text specifically in a much more critical fashion. He and others came up with what's known as the documentary hypothesis, and we'll talk about this maybe more next month when we talk about the origins of Israel. But he divided up the Old Testament into sources, which he thought that the ancient editors had brought together into what we have as our Old Testaments based on, namely, the name of God, as he's given in different, as we know, there are many names given to the Old Testament God, Yahweh, Jehovah, Elohim. And so he thought he could divide up the documents as sources in the Old Testament and sort of unweave them and give a history of the construction of the text, which of course was very critical and not at all of what believers accept as being a given word altogether that ties all together, not as separate sources that are brought in and then put together in this fashion. So this began a very highly critical period of the Bible, and his main history is called Prolegomena to the History of Israel, first published in German. And it became the standard by which scholars even today tend to follow, even though it's the whole documentary hypothesis and the consensus is in tatters. But that's a story for another day. Now along comes William F. Albright. He's considered the father of biblical archaeology. He was a genius. He spoke a dozen or more understood ancient languages, every one of them: Egyptian, Akkadian, that is a cuneiform, ancient Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. And he became one of the first archaeologists who went back and started to dig on all these places that were identified in the Bible. So he's called the father of biblical archaeology, and he was pretty much reacting to the critical nature and spirit of the age, namely through German scholarship, to try to answer the critics with actual discoveries in the ground that could be tied to the Bible and dated accurately enough to provide an answer, as 1 Peter 3:15 says. And he published many books and articles. Namely, this is one where he brings it all together in a long, sort of synthetic work called From the Stone Age to Christianity. Now, we look at all the various methods that we have for doing archaeology today. And this is one which I've used in many of my slides presentations because it concerns the site I've dug at and dealt with the most and published articles in my book regarding. And that is the site of Tel Tayanat, which is in Turkey. So this is an old satellite photo that we've been using in our presentations because it really shows a lot of wonderful detail. This is from a Corona satellite, which operated in the 60s and the 1970s by the CIA. But these were later declassified, and they're used today for various purposes, and in our case, to identify sites like Tel Tayanat in the upper left corner. And it shows other very minor sites where all these arrows are pointing to. And you'll see a river coming up here and meandering its way north and then turning to the west. So and you can see ancient riverbeds here over the millennia that have cut and recut. You have two major sites right here, which are called tells, Tel Tayanat and Tel Achana. Now, this is a close-up of that same photograph of our site at Tel Tayanat. I show that here because I like to show all these dots. These are cores that we did before we actually began excavations. So there's a whole preliminary series of things we do when we start excavating a site. We survey by just walking along the surfaces of these ancient cities or tells, picking up potsherds, determining what periods are represented based on the style of the pottery and the ability to date those sherds. Then you can get a sort of history of occupation at that site as best you can. There's nothing that replaces excavation, but this is a preliminary work that we do to try to determine just how old the site is and which periods are represented throughout our archaeological history. So we can shortcut that process a little bit by doing cores. So this is something that's hand cranked down into the ancient tell, and it can go down meters at a time and then brings up a core. And in those cores, we look at the pottery and can determine roughly the dates that are buried beneath. So these are all different cores that were done preliminary to our actual excavations that began in 2004 at this site in Turkey. Now we've also used aerial photography, which has been used for many, many decades in archaeology. This is a nice aerial view of our site, Tel Tayanat, and you can see the river in the background. Here's the site as we get closer into the actual excavations. This is our excavations back when we had the first couple of seasons. We opened up these squares on the top of the tell. This was all farmland, a large, relatively flat surface on the top that has been farmed for decades by farmers who own this land. But when we began excavations, we apply for a permit from the government of Turkey, and then they grant us the permit, and then they clear off whatever's on the site that they can and give us permission to excavate there. So this is our excavations in the second or third season. Now, tel is an Arabic word meaning ruin, and it's from the Babylonian term tilu, which means a ruin heap. So this is accumulations of debris and construction activity over sometimes thousands of years on the same site, and it tends to build up over time using mostly mud brick as their construction material, but sometimes stone as well when that's available. So you get this mud brick, which disintegrates back into dirt when it's not maintained. So you get reconstructions, destructions, and then new construction, which ends up continuing to pile up over time. Here's a cross section of a tell, and they have very distinctive shapes like this, which have fairly steep sides. This is created by the ancient walls which surrounded the cities. And after the cities have been abandoned, that tends to disintegrate back into dirt, wash out through the rains and the winds. but it's still contained in a fairly steep-sided hill, which is very distinctive when you've seen them. There are literally thousands of these across the Middle East, and probably 90% of them have not been excavated at all ever. So we only have a very small fraction, even in a place like Israel, which is probably the most excavated country on earth, only a fraction of what has ever been left there and yet to be discovered. Here's a sort of a schematic of what a tell looks like, and you start to cut into it like a wedding cake, as we use as the analogy, and the different levels are given. And then you try to assign dates to those various levels based on your finds, mainly pottery, but we have other methods like radiocarbon dating. And if you find inscriptions which can be dated, then that's also very important. Different schematics to show you what stratigraphy looks like. You'll have stratum A, the most recent one. You can see a license plate up here, and then you get into more ancient stuff with pottery and whatever they left, the garbage of the ancients. This one shows very nicely how the walls tend to hold in the debris and the ruins from completely washing out over time and then becoming almost level again with the original ground level. Here's a funny one, and right above the Stone Age strata, he says, you can clearly see artifacts from the Iron Age, right there. Okay, some of the other things we do, everything is done with GPS and hooked into the universal grid. We use total stations, which is what architects and engineers use for mapping and also for positioning strategically within the sites, both elevation-wise and in terms of azimuth and location, lat long. This is something we always have on the site that we're using to mark individual artifacts that are particularly important, and all the different levels in the strata that we dig through. We also have magnetometry here, which you can walk along in what we call transects to get some idea of what's below the ground before you start digging. And this is what a product of a magnetometry survey might look like. You can see subsurface structures, not always clear what they are, but you at least know there's something down there and something of the size and the nature of it possibly. This was done at our site at Tel Tainat. You can see all this mass of different lines and stuff, rectilinear structures as we call them, but you don't really know what they are necessarily until you actually excavate. So we start by clearing out an area to excavate, and this is when we started on our first or second day, cutting down weeds, clearing out an area that we had designated to be our beginning of our excavations back in 2004. Sometimes we burn the brush down to facilitate the matter. And here's our first excavation square, which we dug in 2004. We went fairly deep, and we got all the way down to this deep trench on the bottom of this slide, which goes back to the early Bronze Age. So we're talking about 2,400 or so BC. And only now, after 15 seasons, have we lowered this whole area, which was expanded in 10 by 10 squares, and then 4 of those together make another square. We're only now getting down to that first initial early Bronze Age after 15 seasons. So we go down very carefully, level by level, being very careful to keep all the dating from getting all confused. It's a very meticulous and painstaking process if it's done correctly. Here is, as I said, the main construction method is mud bricks, and I used to call this my parquet floor. This was part of an ancient temple that dates to the time of Solomon. In fact, it's the same ground plan and design as Solomon's temple. If we had, maybe we'll come back to this later and show you just what I mean by that. But this is what you're digging into, and this is solid wall then. And once you cut it cleanly and brush it off, you can see actually the individual bricks as they were laid in ancient times. This dates to about 900 BC. Now, this is one I always found funny. If it's what I think it is, we've got some work ahead of us. So that's the beginning of maybe the Great Pyramid there. Okay, so one of the main things that we use is hand tools. So this is very manual, and it can be very hard work. We use a trowel and a brush. That's one of our main methods. And we use a hand pick. And then if things get a little heavier and if we want to move a little bit more dirt, we use a real pick right here. Whatever it takes to do the job. But of course, we want to make very careful that we're not digging through stuff and destroying it, because once you've dug it up, you've destroyed it, and that's the end of things. So you have to reconstruct where everything was found and keep very close tabs on that so that you can keep the levels, the strata, the dating, and the chronology all correct. This was an empty hole we dug in one part of the tell, which we found hardly anything. but you can see they got pretty deep here. Then we start to find pottery, millions and millions of pieces of broken pottery, almost all of it broken, but sometimes intact. Maybe we can get several sherds we can fit together and glue together. This is a nice painted piece from a crater. Here's another one, which is sort of crosshatch triangles, we call it, different kind of motif. And when I did my study of the pottery, I dealt with all of this beautiful painted pottery, and this would have once been belonged to a crater like this, a multi-handed crater, which is a large open vessel used for various liquids and maybe foodstuffs. And sometimes we find a pot smash like this. For example, this one is all smashed in one place, but we had almost all the pieces intact and we were able to put it back together. This is now in the museum in Turkey in Antakya, which is ancient Antioch. Another nice bowl here, which was photographed, as you can see here. This is my digital drawing with the colors trying to match the originals, and other parallel vessels found here that were very similar to this type. This is called late Helladic 3C ware. We'll get into this later. Okay, if even find inscriptions at times. This is Luvian hieroglyphic, which dates to about 800 to 900 BC. It's broken, but it was once part of a monumental inscription that was in place in the city way back then. There's a nice photograph of it. There's my office, as I call it, doing mostly paperwork as other people did the digging. So I didn't get to have the fun that I like to have as one of the diggers, as a supervisor. And then we actually had a roof constructed over our area in order to preserve it in the off season from being, once it's open, then it's open to the elements again, and it can be washed away and destroyed and filled in with water and such, weeds and dirt. So we kept our excavation areas clear in the off season for our excavation time during the summer season. And this, of course, made it really nice in the summertime to dig under a roof in the shade. We have lunches under a shade cloth out on the site. Typically, we find all kinds of cool little things like this little doll or figurine, which dates to the early Bronze period, about 2200 BC. We call them big bird figurines for obvious reasons. And here's a couple of my diggers in a pit that we had dug out. You get to be fairly close with the workers that we employ from the local area. We have both Arabs and Turks in this area, which is right along the border of Turkey and Syria. And digging in style. This is my Blues Brothers version of archaeology. And we sift. We take all the dirt that we're digging with and sift it for small things like beads and seeds and small pieces of bone and such. I'm going to skip this one because we don't have time to deal with the video, which is about 2 minutes long. We also take radiocarbon samples. This is a piece of ancient wood that we sampled very carefully. You don't touch it. And it gives us radiocarbon samples. We dig these sections. We dig nice, clean walls so that we can look at the stratigraphy once it's all dug up, and we draw them by hand. And this is a hypothetical section drawing, which shows you different levels of different things, different periods of time, again, going deeper and more ancient. We wash off all the pottery that we find, all the dirty pottery by hand with water and a little scrub brush. And then we lay it out on tables to dry. And then we go through every single piece and read them for the period of time they represent and any other notable features. We record everything, the numbers, we put them in bags in separate places as to where they were found exactly, because that's very important. We register the important potsherds with a serial number. Now I'm going to go, it's 1 o'clock now. If you'll indulge me, we'll go another 10 minutes, if that's okay. And I think I can finish up in reasonable time. This is our lab. So indoors, we're processing all of the finds that we have, putting them into databases, doing drawings, paperwork, recording descriptions of what we're digging up, et cetera. This is very time consuming. You probably spend as much time or more processing as you do digging. We draw the pottery. The pottery is probably one of the most important artifact categories because of what it can tell us about the date of a site and also perhaps even the ethnic group that was living there. So we take the pieces of pottery that are more important, we draw them by hand, and we photograph them as well. Here's a drawing I made of one particular potsherd, which shows a bird of some sort. So everything is then digitized and put into plates with displayed pottery of similar types, which I'll show you examples of here in a moment. This was our dig team in 2006. So it's a lot of fun, but it's a lot of hard work. I'll show you a little bit of another way of acquiring data. This is a tomb that I am publishing that I did not dig myself. That was dug actually before I was born. And it's languished and not been published fully for all of these years. And now finally it's been passed down from person to person. And I'm trying to bring all together the evidence, which is lying in various museums in Jordan, Israel, and in the US, um, to try to bring it into a final publication, a very marvelous and richly um, adorned and tomb with thousands of pottery vessels and other artifacts. There were human remains. There are Egyptian scarabs. There are weapons. There are metal vessels in addition to the ceramic vessels. This is at the site of Tel Dotan or Dothan, which you see on the map on the left. On the right, what was done in this particular study very recently was the dental remains that were kept. Unfortunately, the human remains were reburied after the excavations, but the dental remains, the teeth were kept, and they have been subjected to modern analysis using strontium analysis and C14 dates. So what this shows, this map is a geological map which shows the different kinds of soil and stone which underlay the area of Israel, and in particular the site of Dotan, which is circled in red. And you can determine based on the teeth using the measures of strontium where that person was likely lived and was raised based upon the kind of minerals that are in the actual teeth or the bones. So they can determine based upon a number of individuals and their teeth that the people that were examined were probably local and didn't come from anywhere other than the local area. Here's just a rough plan of the tomb that we're talking about here. And this dates to about 1300 to 1000 or so BC. This straddles the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age. And in biblical terms, this would be the period of Joshua into the period of Judges and in the early royal period of First Kings, when Israel became a nation with kings. What this shows here is the remains of this tomb, which were stratified in their own right, and the various teeth that were examined. Now, the skulls that are given over here on the left are gone, but this is just the number that was counted when they first excavated way back when. The teeth, though, are the teeth that have been kept, and you can see here from the various levels the number of teeth that were subjected to these analyses. And the results were using the human dental enamel, and then this various, it's called radiogenic strontium isotope ratios, stable oxygen and carbon isotope values. Now, we have scientists who actually do these tests. As archaeologists, we just dig the stuff up and we hand it off in various cases to specialists who can deal with these various artifacts in a more physically scientific way to measure certain things. As I said, one of their findings was that they believe all individuals in the tomb, at least the ones that they examined, were from the local area. They had not migrated in, because this is a period of time when the Israelites were coming into the land and replacing the Canaanites they were fighting to get control of the land, the so-called promised land. So in this case, it appears that these were Canaanites and that these were not foreign people that had come in from somewhere else. Also, their dating contradicts some of the dating done by the pottery analysis. We won't go into those details now. Another thing that we do now is DNA analysis. And in this particular case, at a Philistine cemetery at the site of Ashkelon, they had a number of individuals, 108 skeletal elements from that well-known Philistine city of Ashkelon, which they did DNA analysis of and found that they were most closely parallel to other ancient remains of peoples from Southern Europe, or the Balkan area here, which includes ancient Greece. Before it was Greece, actually, going back to the late Bronze Age, early Iron Ages, before there was a Greece. But we're going back to the time of the Trojan War, around about 1200 BC, 1100 BC. So what this DNA analysis of skeletal remains from Ashkelon shows is that Philistines were most likely, we know they came from the outside. Their material culture appears to be derived from ancient Greece at the time, because mainly of its pottery, but other things that have been examined. But DNA analysis seems to corroborate that theory that they came from ancient Greece. They were sort of what we might call Proto-Greeks. In addition, DNA analysis was done with pig remains. And we know one of the ways we can mark Israelite sites in antiquity is that they don't have pig remains because it was forbidden for them to eat pigs. So Philistines didn't have any such prohibition. So there were lots of pig bones at Philistine sites. And they were able to determine, they actually found that modern pigs or boars actually had the same DNA signature, if you will, of ancient pigs brought from Greece. And their theory is that unlike all the other countries around Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, were also wild boar roam to this day, they do not have this sort of European pig DNA signature. They have Asian pig DNA. So Israel stands out in that part of its modern wild boar population actually bears the remnants of what are thought to be boar or pigs brought over from ancient Greece by the Philistines around about 1100, 1200 BC. So once again, DNA analysis allows us to really learn more about the ancient world and the people that live there. Finally, I think this may be the last thing. We actually, I referenced earlier, there are satellite photos, aerial photography has been used, and also drones are now used at almost all the ancient sites. This is an example of a drone here that was used at a site in Israel. And this is a little video that I would show you, but we don't have time, where it goes up and starts to provide images, video images. And these are stills that were taken just a couple of minutes after when that video starts there. And it shows the excavation areas, as you can see here. It's the top of a hill in a site in southern Israel called Khirbet al-Rai, which is thought to be possibly biblical Ziklag, which is associated with King David and the Philistines. But here's some beautiful shots of Khirbet al-Rai, which Khirbet again is a ruin, and it's a hilltop site that was occupied and built during the time of David. It has Philistine pottery, which has been excavated there, so it's thought that the Philistines originally occupied the site. Now, very quickly here, this is an article that our site and our team produced 2 years ago, which brings together a lot of our information we gathered over 14 seasons. And this is how it all comes together. A little fancy title here about shifting networks, community identity, a tale tying out in the Iron One. This is only the 12th of the 10th century BC. You can see that satellite photography that I referenced earlier. It shows all our excavation areas, all these different fields we've designated. These bars show what we found on surveys walking along the site, different kinds of pottery and the density of that pottery. The red bar areas are where greater density of pottery sherds were found. And again, this is before we began excavations at all. This shows a plan that was drawn of one particular area that we excavated, actually myself. This upper left corner, we have photographs of some of the pits and silos that were excavated. And then we have the pottery plates, which almost every excavation report has mucho of, because pottery is so very important. We line up, most of these are just based on rim sherds or broken pieces, but we can reconstruct the whole vessel type based on what we know of these vessels. And these are all similar type vessels, all drawn on a similar page we call a plate. This is some of the painted pottery that I dealt with and that I published both here and elsewhere. You can see that bowl that I referenced earlier. I showed you the photograph of it. So these all have painted motifs on them. And then we look at the chronology to try to date everything as accurately as possible. And we find that based on radiocarbon dates and other ways of dating, like the pottery, we have our various field phases. We try to break it down as precise as we can here with these field phases, roughly going from 1200 to 1000 BC. And then our final page here shows parallels with other sites in the area, places like Çatalhöyük, Tel Afis, and other places you've never heard of, and tie into that overall grid of chronology in the region to get a better idea of how it ties into everything overall. So I'll finish right here at 110 with one of my famous quotes and people from the past, Blaise Pascal, who was a French mathematician and scientist and Christian from the 17th century. And he says, God has given evidence which is sufficiently great for those with an open mind and an open heart, but which is sufficiently vague so as not to compel those whose hearts are closed. So we have loads, we have a treasure trove of evidence to corroborate our Bibles, Old and New Testaments. We're going to get into that in the coming months. But if you're sufficiently skeptical or you don't want to hear the truth, then you're not going to hear the evidence probably either. However, I still think there's a role to be played. As 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be ready to give an account. And archaeology is a good account of things that do corroborate and support through evidence and scientific studies the history that we read of in the Bible. So I will finish with that, with the end. And thank you for your attention.